history at California State University, Stanislaus. So it was my first experience doing that. I have been teaching art history for 6 years at a local community college in Stockton, California, which is about maybe 45 minutes away from here. And that is something that I've just been doing online for 6 years. I did work there as an archivist and a librarian for about 6 years as well. And I've been at Stan for 4 years as a full-time archivist and librarian. I'm also a certified archivist with the Academy of Certified Archivists. And this was the first semester that I had an opportunity to teach art history at the California State University level. So I was super excited about that. I turned it down at first because I thought, oh my goodness, it's so much work. I'm going to still be doing my full-time archivist position. And then I'm going to be teaching a class 2 days a week in person. And then my side gig is as an adjunct at the community college that I mentioned earlier. So I didn't know what I was in for, but with all the budget cuts that we've had recently, I thought it would be a great opportunity. So the first time I taught it was this past spring, 2025. And I basically had 14 modules. It's an art, museums, and society class. So it teaches basically the history of museology, and it goes into art museums specifically and how it affects society and all the sociocultural aspects of museums. And I thought, as a person who is a librarian and an archivist and teaches art history, this would be a great opportunity to bring students into special collections and university archives. And I was given a lot of flexibility by the head of art history here at California State University, Stanislaus. And so she said, hey, if you want to teach this class as a hands-on, having the students help you do exhibits, because I do a lot of exhibits, at least 2 a semester, that highlight the collections. She said I could do that, but I really wanted to teach it as a more traditional museological theory class. But I also wanted to integrate special collections and archives wherever I could, including the collections as well as all of the workflows that we have within special collections and archives. So I taught 14 modules, and I'm only going to focus on 6 of them today. So 6 of the 14 modules, which I think align most closely with libraries, archives, and museums, otherwise known as LAMs. And so I'm going to focus on 6 of those. The first module that I taught that I think aligns really well, again, there were 14, but I'm only going to focus on 6 of them, were origins of the public museum. So this was an excellent module, I think, to incorporate archives, workflows, archives history, as well as libraries. So the history of libraries and museums are inextricably intertwined. The most famous example goes back to classical antiquity and the library at Alexandria, which was established between 285 and 246 before current era. So this ancient library was part of a large museon. Now, museon becomes the word museum, and museon comes from the word muses, right? So this goes all the way back to the muses. So this ancient library was actually part of a large museon, and it was critical to the transmission of knowledge and the preservation of classical texts. Now, there is a consensus that the museon, the ancient museon, which would become the word museum, and library established at Alexandria were home to some of the ancient world's greatest minds. Here, scholars edited texts, they cataloged, and they transformed scholarship. The library's collections were reputed to have numbered more than 500,000 at their greatest number. And this was the basis for much of the classical literature that survived the dissolution of Hellenic civilization. And of course, a lot of this was revived during the Proto-Renaissance and during the Renaissance. However, there's so much that we probably lost during this period. And when the library at Alexandria and museum fell into decline, which was in the early decades. I guess you could say it was like 4th century current era, but there are many theories as to why and how the Great Library of Alexandria fell into dissolution, or how it died eventually. So the discussion of the Library of Alexandria was a perfect opportunity for a brief discussion on the history of the book, incidentally. So I was able to include information about that during this module. And we talked about how, textual information was once stored on tablets, then scrolls, then later sheets, and ultimately in bound books. And one of the items in the collection that I was able to incorporate during this module on origins of the public museum was an old antiphonary, I think I'm saying that right, Latin parchment leaf from 1150 current era. And so I took this out. It's actually rather large, this sheet. And it's, I think, 24 by 36 inches, but this was also a great opportunity because the class was actually held in the reading room, and I did have 26 students. So this was one of the first modules to Origins of the Public Museum. So I brought that out into the reading room, and I got the white gloves out, and I had the students put the white gloves on, and we talked about how you handle rare materials. And they were actually able to handle this material and get up close if they wanted to. So that was an excellent, I think, item to include during this session. We also talked a lot about Aristotle during this module on the public museum, and how he really was one of the first catalogers, he and all the individuals and the great scholars that worked with Aristotle. And we talked about the idea of res publica, the idea of doing things for the greater good of democracy, for the greater public good, and kind of that allegiance that we have as cultural heritage workers to the public good and preserving culture and making it accessible for the public good. So in a way, this was a very excellent module that spread across or aligned well with libraries, archives, and museums. Now, the second module that I want to cover is the one that we had on World's Fairs. And those of you who are archivists, I'm sure you have a lot of World's Fairs materials in your archives and special collections. So during this module, the class studied the origins of World's Fairs, and we began with the Great Exhibition of 1851 in England, also referred to as the Crystal Palace. This is often considered the first official World's Fair. It was massive. There were 14,000 exhibitors from across the world, and the great exhibition of the Crystal Palace itself was made of 293,000 panes of glass, and the structure was massive. It was 990,000 square feet with ceilings 128 feet high. I had some excellent slides to show you during this session, but I don't have them, unfortunately, because my computer crashed. But so I had some wonderful images from the Crystal Palace, but one item that I really had that was fantastic to share, that was part of our collection during this session on the World's Fairs, was our collection of Punch magazine. So Punch magazine was a satirical magazine published from the 1840s to the turn of the 20th century, but it's had republications throughout the 20th and I think a little bit in the 21st century. But really its heyday, Punch magazine's heyday, was the 1840s through the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So I had actual Punch magazines from the 1850s and from 1851 when the Crystal Palace opened its doors. And I was able to share some satirical cartoons about the Crystal Palace. And in fact, the nickname Crystal Palace given to the Great Exhibition, that was actually coined by a writer and artist working for Punch magazine at the time. So this is an excellent collection to incorporate. And I'd recently gotten this collection from CSU Northridge. They had gotten rid of it. And so it was really exciting to be able to share this with the students. Now, I was also able to share a few local World's Fairs. We're in the Central Valley in California, kind of in the heart of California. geographically. And we're not too far from San Francisco. We're about an hour and a half from San Francisco. So a lot of the students were familiar with some of the vestiges of World's Fairs. And I had some great materials and the ideal materials in our collections as well to share with them. But the first one would be the Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915 that was held in San Francisco. And so I had a book of poetry, an ode of poetry that was written for that international exposition. I was able to point out how poetry is a primary source, and I brought out the actual book of poems. And then also I was able to share some photographs that we had, one of which was a panoramic photograph of the Palace of Fine Arts, which still exists. So that's one of the vestiges that one can see if you go to San Francisco. And a lot of the students were familiar with that. So it was a great way to make the World's Fairs more accessible to the students. And moving forward from 1915 to 1939, there was the Golden Gate International Exposition, which was held on Treasure Island. And those of you who've been to San Francisco, you know that when you're going over the Bay Bridge, there's this man-made island, and it's called Treasure Island. I think it was originally created for the military, but they used it in 1939 for a World's Fair. And there are still some vestiges of the original World's Fair, not very many left, but you can still see a few if you go to Treasure Island. And I had a wonderful brochure from that period, from 1939, from that World's Fair. And it had a fold-out map, which I was going to show you in the slides. It had a fold-out map. And I actually have a picture of me digitizing it in the slides. But it was really fun to talk about this because the fold-out map looked like something you might see from an amusement park. Of course, those of you who can remember, if you've been to Disneyland or any other amusement park, they used to give you a fold-out map. I think they sometimes do still. I think you can actually access a print version, but now it's more common to see it online. But this fold-out map, which is an aerial perspective of Treasure Island, was a really fun opportunity to talk about how these World's Fairs kind of set the precedent, not just for exhibit techniques, but also for amusement parks as well. And it looks so much like a kind of map that you might see for Disneyland, et cetera. And then we talked about, incidentally, how It's a Small World, which is in Disneyland Park, was originally at a World's Fair in New York, and then it was moved to Disneyland, where it's become a permanent fixture. So the World's Fairs, that was a really fun module to cover during this class, Art, Museums, and Society. And I think it aligns well with what we do as archivists and librarians as well. And the third module that I think aligns well with LAMS, or Libraries, Archives, and Museums, is the module that I taught on heritage. So during this module, the class explored the concept and definitions of heritage, both tangible and intangible heritage. We also talked about challenges and concerns of heritage related to museology, and we had some very thought-provoking conversations on how heritage can be used to express ideas of nostalgia, sometimes in a negative way, and alternatively, memories of traumatic pasts. Now, tangible heritage comprises artifacts, artworks, manuscripts, monuments, archaeological sites, and historic buildings, while intangible heritage comprises cultural experiences, such as traditions, oral histories, performing arts, and rituals. So the students looked at firsthand examples of tangible heritage from the archives. For example, I had a flag that was used during a Cesar Chavez march in 2014. He died prior to that, many years prior to that, but this was kind of a memorial march to Cesar Chavez, which was held at our campus, and it's in our archives, and it was actually signed by his widow, as well as his brother. And his brother actually designed the United Farm Workers logo, which is on the flag. So it's a red and black flag with that logo. And I brought that out during this module, and the students were able, to look at it in real life. But then I also showed them what a catalog record for the flag looked like in archive space, and all the metadata that I capture as an archivist, so that that record can be searchable. And if people want to request that item to see it, they can. And I also showed them the digital object that I created for it, which has an image of the flag that I took. So that was an example of tangible heritage. And I also shared a manuscript from another one of our collections, the Bernice Wood collection, called My Philosophy of Life. So they were able to view some actual examples of tangible heritage in the archives. We also talked about um, different things like buildings, how buildings are examples of tangible heritage, as well as landscapes. And we discussed Yosemite National Park as an example of a natural habitat and landscape that is tangible. And it is listed on UNESCO's tangible list of World Heritage Sites. And that was a good example because it's pretty close to us. We're considered one of the gateway cities to Yosemite. And so a lot of the students were familiar with Yosemite and had been there, but we also looked at lots of other national and international examples as well. And for the intangible examples, we looked at UNESCO's Intangible Heritage List, which is excellent, and they're constantly updating it as well. And so they were able to get examples of intangible heritage through looking at that site. Now, the next module that I covered during this course was collection and collection practices. And during this module, the class considered the often unique and diverse motivations that collectors have for collecting, along with the wide variety and types of collections, from rare curated collections to the more ephemeral and everyday. And because during the class, Art Museums Society, we were looking at a lot of different museum collections. This time I focused more on some of the unique and I would say definitely more popular culture types of collections. We watched a small video on a gentleman who collects garden gnomes. He has since passed. He lives in London. And so we looked at his collection of garden gnomes to break down the idea that collections have to just be looked through the perspective of a museum, and kind of these kind of high art collections that we had been reviewing. And we also looked at how museum collection practices are informed by the broader mission of the institution. We broke down the anatomy of a museum collection management policy, and we looked at the different elements that define a policy, all the way from the mission of the organization, the vision, to acquisition policies, disposition policies, legal issues to be concerned with, etc. And I was really surprised during this module that the students really got into the more prescriptive elements that were required for a collections management policy. And I had them I had them do a homework assignment where they went online and they found a collections management policy that was available generally as a PDF. So like the Getty is really good at making their policy available online. And we also looked at the Smithsonian Museum's collections policy. And I was again, as I said, I was very surprised that the students were so into this and really wanted to look at the anatomy of how this type of policy is put together. And I guess I was kind of happy about this because these are the kind of things that get me excited too, as someone who manages an archives and who is a certified archivist. We have different delineated roles and responsibilities that we're supposed to adhere to. And so when I first became an archivist at CSU Stanislaus, I set up my collections management policy manual, etc. And so that was very exciting to see them get into that. And I think it was very valuable too for any students who were planning on doing cultural heritage work later on. This class, Art Museums and Society, that I taught in the reading room, it's part of the Museum Studies minor, which is new to our campus. It was just established last year. But it's also part of our art history bachelor's degree. So some of the students were getting ready to graduate. So it was nice to see them get into this module on collections and collection practices. The next module that we covered, the second to last one, was museum ethics. And this is another one that I thought was really important to share with the students. Throughout the class, we had looked at the different missions that say someone who is who works for like an auction house and the kind of work that they do versus someone who works for a cultural heritage institution and the different types of ethics that they have to adhere to. And that idea, getting back to res publica and the public museum, doing things for the greater good, preserving culture for the greater good. So this was another chance to really delve into museum ethics and the ethics of cultural heritage institutions in general. So during this module, I asked the class to consider how ethics are foundational to everything that a museum does, from the management of its collections, the expectations of the training of its staff, and how the museum responds to challenging ethical situations. We discussed how collections are held in the public trust, getting back to that idea of res publica, and are in essence public property, and how we're just basically the custodians of that property. This idea also echoed, as I said, the earlier lesson on the public museum and res publica and the idea of serving the public good. We read and we discussed a few case studies involving ethics violations in museums, a few of which were really high profile. Like there was one that happened in Turkey, where it was only upon an individual, a scholar from Turkey visiting, I think it was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he noticed that there were items from a Turkish archaeological find on display that basically were bought unethically. Okay, so we discussed that high profile case and how the materials eventually had to go back to Turkey. And then we discussed another high profile case where a curator had some gambling debts. And I can't remember what museum it was on my slides, but he had to settle some gambling debts. So he had basically a replica made of an item that was in the collection. And it was only upon cleaning the item that one of the museum staff noticed that the weight was different from the weight that was captured in the metadata, in the catalog information. And this again allowed me to reemphasize how important cataloging is, because since there was this weight difference, they realized that it was a replica and it wasn't the original. And ultimately, the museum director that had done this was found guilty, and he spent some time in prison, etc. So we talked about some really high-profile cases, but we also talked about more nuanced cases, like or examples. Say, for instance, you're working for an institution or a corporation, and you're told to do something that, according to your professional organization, such as the Academy of Certified Archivists, just as an example, you know that that is something that's unethical. And how sometimes you might be the only expert in your field working at your organization who has that code of ethics. And so how you have to speak up, and how that can be difficult, but, it's important to keep in mind your professional ethics versus your organizational imposed ethics. So it was really fun. And that was a great module for discussion and to look at some high profile cases, but also look at some more nuanced examples of ethics as they relate to cultural heritage organizations. Now, the last module was on the museum profession. Again, I had 14 modules, but here I'm just discussing six of the modules that I think align most well with what we do in archives and libraries, as well as in museums. So the last one was the museum profession, and this was a spring class. So I did have some students who were graduating, and it was a great time to really look at, the different sites that are out there, including UNESCO's job sites, ICOM, the International Council of Museums, AAM, the Alliance of American Museums and their job sites, as well as the California Alliance of Museums for a more local source. So we looked at all of those different job sites. But during this module as well, we considered the growth of museum employment, the history of museum employment, the historical development of the professionalization of museum work, challenges, and an overview of roles, responsibilities, and skills required for the different types of cultural heritage work. And if any of you have ever been on the UNESCO job site, you know how many different types of jobs there are available in cultural heritage institutions. And so I gave the students an assignment where they were doing that, and they were looking at the different types of jobs that were out there. But we also talked about the kind of some of the big, most iconic jobs that are out there in museums, such as curator, conservator, someone who works in operations, and within operations and security. We also looked at research positions as well, and then also education, how there are different education positions available in museums. And of course, jobs such as curating exhibits, that's like the most popular. So we spent some time looking at that. We talked about how conservator and restoration positions usually require very specific type of education and skill set, and how it usually takes longer to get in those types of more or a longer training period to achieve those types of positions. But we looked at the different types of roles and responsibilities, and they had an assignment where they would choose one type of job, and they would go out and find an actual job posting and talk about how their current skill sets would fit within that type of job and why they were interested in that specific cultural heritage position, why they found it interesting. And I think, like I said, this was an ideal module with which to end the course. And we took an in-depth look at career sites offered through, as I mentioned, UNESCO, the American Alliance of Museums, and the International Council of Museums. And in conclusion, I believe that there were significant benefits to teaching an art history museum studies class in special collections and university archives. And again, it was held in our reading room. It was a lot of work. It was like, I can't believe I did it while working my full-time position, and then also having, I teach a class or two during the regular semester online in art history at a community college as well. But teaching this course from the perspective of someone who works across libraries, archives, and art history, and with the advantage of teaching in a cultural heritage environment, was an invaluable experience for me. But I also think it was an incredible experience for the students too. It provided the opportunity to incorporate several materials from special collections and archives into class lectures, some of which I've discussed here. It secondly brought students into special collections and archives who may not even know about our services and resources, or who may never have the chance to use these services or resources. And in a budget crunch environment, I thought that was a really strategic move as well. Lastly, I think it provided students insight into the day-to-day cultural heritage work of SCUA. And I think I've shared during this presentation that, where I could, I'd point to like catalog records and, how I would do that and why they're important, et cetera. Thus, I think the real life experience and the hands-on work that I provided the perspective into, combined with theory and scholarship, was a really invaluable experience. And I would hope that I get to teach this class in the future at CSU Stanislaus. And I hope it'll be a model and inspiration to other people who want to teach this type of course within the environment of special collections and archives. And I'll just end with a quote. According to Zorbik, Weibel, and Irway, traditionally libraries, archives, and museums have divided their content into piecemeal offerings based on the nature and focus of their collections. But in recent years, however, the desire to bring these different yet interrelated services together has gained prominence. And so I think it was just a wonderful opportunity. And that is the end of my presentation. And I'm so sorry that I did not have slides to share with you, but my Mac computer literally died and went black. But I'm glad that I was able to at least share with you an overview of how I taught this class in special collections and archives. And did anybody have any questions? So let's see, Louis, should I go ahead and stay on since there are no questions?
Mary, I think you're welcome to stay on if you'd like to, but also if you wanted to give time back for yourself, that's okay too.
Okay, so sorry about the computer issue, but yeah, thank you so much, you guys, for listening today. And I'm gonna go ahead and put my email, which was on my slides, in case anybody has any follow-up questions, or if you would like me to share the slides, I would be very happy to do that once I'm able to get back to my other computer. But thank you for listening today, and I will go ahead and sign off. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.